right, more people are joining in, which is very good. Let's wait for a moment longer, and then we will start sharp at 4 p.m. the European Standard Time.
At the ring of the bell.
Yes, which is now.
Really?
Yes.
Yes. Alrighty then. Welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, hello, servus, as we say in Bavaria. Welcome to yet another Great Rancor webinar. This time we'll be talking about the SharePoint framework and why you should analyze the SharePoint framework code that you're doing. I'm your host, Matthias. I have with me today my fabulous colleague and pretty much developer god, Microsoft MVP, PNP core team member, Waldek Mastykarz.
Hi, everybody.
Would you like to introduce yourself real quickly?
Well, I mean, you've already did, right? So, hi, everybody. As Tia said, I am MVP. I'm also a part of the PNP team where we help developers all over the world to try to do the right thing when extending SharePoint and Office 365 to their needs. At Rancor, I am head of product where I help the customers to get a grip on their 365 investments, SharePoint investments, and basically applications that they build to tailor these systems to their needs. And today, as Tia said, we will talk a little about whether or not you should analyze everything that you build in SharePoint Framework and why there would be the need to do it. So with that, I think we had one more announcement regarding the Q&A. TS, right?
Exactly. Couple ground rules. If you have questions, and you're more than welcome to post them, please post them in the questions and answers section that you see at the bottom of your Zoom screen, Zoom window. We would love to address or answer the questions at the end of the webinar. If there's like really urgent ones or really fitting ones, questions, we will insert them at the point of where we are right now, but in general, we would like to answer them at the end of the webinar. We will have a couple of kind of quick polls that we will be running during the webinar that you can answer. You don't have to. You will answer them anonymously, so feel free to, answer them openly. After the webinar, you will be sent the link to the recording as well. No matter if you participated, as long as you signed up, you will get the recording link. I think this is pretty much it. We're good to go to jump right in, I think. Waldek, over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Cool. So I think that the common ground for many of us is still the way we used to extend product in the past, right? So we would build farms, solutions, and majority of folks know how it works, right? So they know the pros and cons, the way things work. So even though it's not as heavily used now, I use it a lot to basically draw the analogy compared to where we are now versus where we come from, right? So with that, let's have a quick recap of WSPs and how they were built, right? So we all agree that that was .NET code that we would run. It would run on the SharePoint server. Basically, it would use the server-side rendering because, like, we're talking here about the time period 2007, even 2006. Until even now, you still can use them, right? So back then, we didn't really have this rich experiences, frameworks, and so forth and so on to do things in the client side. So instead, we would really heavily rely on ASP.NET server-side rendering and to basically get or perform all of the operations server-side, right? The caveat of that was, so the big upside was that everything that we would build would tightly integrate into the farm, right? So, and with that, you could get the benefit of things like building timer jobs, taking part in backups and all that. So you would get all of that for free because your code ran as part of that. Like, no matter what you would build, it would become in the end an integral part of the whole farm. But at the same time, that was the downside, right? Because your code because it was such a big part of the farm, it could also bring it down. If things went really bad, you could bring the farm down. And over the course of years, we learn hard way sometimes about these really, at some point, famously known issues, um, like memory disposal, right? If you didn't dispose well, object like the SP web or SP site, like you could eat up memory from the farm, eventually bringing it down, right? So you would first see that it would slow down, going to the point where it couldn't really do anything, right? And then another famous case was where you would iterate basically over all items in the list in a way that would basically hog down the resources, because on every item it would then retrieve all items from this list, right? So over the course of years, to recap, we learned these patterns, these do's and don'ts in server-side code, SharePoint code, basically to avoid these known issues. Now, the interesting thing, if we draw analogy to fast forward where we are now, since 3 years, we had this new model named SharePoint Framework available to us that we can build to, or that we can use to extend SharePoint both on premises and online to our needs. And it's not quite comparable because there are some things that you cannot do using Java, right? Because that is the first property that is different of it. It runs 100% on the client. It's fully JavaScript based, right? There is no server-side component to it. Like if you need, for example, to have a long running operations, you wouldn't implement that in browser because somebody could move to another page or could close the tab browser and so forth and so on, and the process would die, right? So instead, you'll probably use something else, like build a function app on Azure or something else that will then do the operation and which you would call out from your web part or UI part, right? So with that, SharePoint Framework is the, let's say, UI piece of how you would extend SharePoint to your needs. It runs exclusively on the client-side rendering, but there are also, like, it's not without its, you could say, issues, limitations, things to take into account. So what do you think? And I'd like you to use the chat for that to give me a few ideas off the top of your head. Like, what do you see as the most common problems, considerations, call them issues, that there are, or risks maybe even, regarding to using SharePoint frameworks applications in production? So I'll give you a moment to type a few things in a chat, and once yeah, we we have it, we'll take a moment to go through them and see if there's anything interesting to elaborate on. But I'd love you now to take a few moments to type like the first thing that comes up in your mind regarding what are the most common issues in your opinion regarding to using SharePoint framework in production. So we see some comments, conflicts in external libraries, potentially putting proprietary information. Migrations are hard. Yeah. So basically giving away the business logic and so forth and so on, because that works, all of that, the code works in browser, authentication, information protection, lack of APIs to access LOB. Yep, that is also an interesting thing. There are fewer devs available, so it's not such commodity. The skill set you need is not commodity comparing to other models. And also the danger that the person who uses the page might be too powerful. Yeah, so these are all valid concerns. And what you already really understand from the few things that I said is that issues are more complex. Like they are all over the place, varying from the skills to APIs to permissions, and not as it was in the past where they were very much specific to something, things in the code, some things that you could relatively easily check, right? So there are multiple things for us to take into account. And basically, to recap, well, what I said, like things like vulnerable code, performance, even though you just run in browser, there are still things that you can do to bring down even the whole tenant for the whole company, right? So we will talk about that too. So important thing for you to keep in mind from uh, uh, now on is that yes, there is a need to validate your SharePoint framework code because there are some things that could have big impact on your tenant. So first, right, there's this big change where in the past when you would build code, for a big part there would be like majority of the code that went to a package would be the code that you either wrote yourself and maybe to some point like you would do exception and you would reuse something like UI controls from Telerik, DevExpress, and so forth and so on. But the majority of the code would be your own. Nowadays, that is not the case anymore. Nowadays is this trend that there is so much out there, and SPFx basically uses the same web development approach as any kind of other modern web app, right? So it's based on a Node.js based stack with npm, and you can more easily than ever tap into this over 1 million packages on npm to basically add them to your application and speed up development, right? So why reinvent the wheel? Instead, just pull packages, and there are packages that vary for everything from utils to things like building charts, exploring 3D objects. All of that is already available for you to use, right? So you can pull all of that in and basically build things that are specific to your company or a customer, right? So just focus on the value add, on the very specific things you need, and do not reinvent the wheel. Now, on the other hand, challenge with that is, or that comes with the price that these libraries are built by different people all over the world. And like because like the more they are being used, the bigger the chance that people will find an issue with that, an issue that could be exploited, that could expose you to risks, right? So in other in other words, the um, code that you use to speed up development also comes with a price that it exposes you to risks, right? So you should be aware of that. You should not blindly trust the code you pull in from internet because think about it. You pull in some code written by somebody else, someone you don't know, and that code will run as a part of your intranet, as a part of your corporate intranet where you store confidential data, when you might store HR records and whatnot. That code will be able to get access to any kind of information stored in your tenant on behalf of the person who is currently visiting the page. So if it's CEO, if it's HR manager, these people often have like highly privileged access to everything across the whole intranet, right? And if you, for example, build a web part that shows the weather, like probably the obtaining the weather, like that is something that you wouldn't build yourself, right? Because like you don't have forecast services and so forth and so on, right? So you'd probably pull in a library that does that. You would integrate that in your web part, and you would maybe apply some styles to align it with everything else on the page. But you would have with that a third-party piece of code that would run as an integral part of your page, and that code could then do anything, right? So if you didn't pay attention and somebody would put something malicious to that code, you wouldn't know unless you validate that that code is solid, that that code is safe, and that there's no way to exploit it. Right? So with that, let me run a quick poll with you regarding how often do you check your code, right? And I will leave the poll open for a moment so that you can vote. As Tia said already, you vote anonymously, so there is no way for me to tell who is who, right? But it's more about all of us to understand the idea, like how often do we look into that? Is this a thing that is on top of our mind? Or is it something that we do either as an afterthought, or maybe we don't do it at all because we basically trust that things like jQuery or something else is just safe, right? Because it's used by such a big audience that there is no chance that somebody would put something malicious into it. So I would just leave the poll open for a moment because there are still some votes coming in, but there is a big trend seeing that that majority of folks do not validate dependencies at all, right? I think that the results stopped coming in. So well, there are a few more coming in. Let me just open it for 10 more seconds. Right. All right. So let's stop now. And so it seems like that majority of us never really looks at dependencies. And I think it's a shame because I see it as the biggest threat, right? Like if you pay attention to the DevSecOps space or sec space, InfoSec space, um, like you hear over and over again that there was a breach, that there was data leak, that there was something. Like famous case from I think that was beginning of the last year was that many government sites across the world would use a service that helps people who are visually impaired to read up the contents of the page, right? So basically you would have a button on the page, you would press play, and that service, that code would read up the contents of the page. Now, at some point somewhere, injected malicious code into the library that would do that, and for some time, no one really knows for how long exactly, uh, all these government sites across the world would mine bitcoins. And it took them really long to actually figure out that, hey, like if I go to this side, the usage of my CPU spikes, and then somebody would dig through the coins like, hey, like why is this site mining coins? I mean, like collecting tax is one, right? But to mine coins on citizens like that isn't fair. And then finally they brought it back to the library that was hacked, and it turned out that somewhere between building and deployment of the library, someone was able to exfiltrate the keys and inject some additional code, right? So so like in this case, like there was really not much harm done. But think about it. Think about like if people are able to do that, what kind of harm they could do to your intranet where you have confidential stuff stored. Like these are the things that we need to be aware of because this is the way we build things nowadays. And also these are the modern threats, if you like. Things that weren't as relevant in the past because that approach wasn't as widely used as it is now. Right. So this is a very thing, at least on the top of my head, when I think about like what are the things that you really need to have in place when you think about building things in SPFx, right? Let me go to PowerPoint. Yeah. So another thing is specifically to SPFx is, as I said, typically whenever you um, whenever you build things in SPFx, like these scripts by default become an integral part of the page. So if you have done in the past things with add-ins, you were able to build an add-in part, and that add-in part was basically an iframe pointing to your page located on a different domain, different URL. So you got in a way a sandbox environment, and you couldn't really do much. Like if there was malicious code, it couldn't escape the iframe. So it was only allowed to do the few things that were a part of the contract between the add-in and the code, right? So if you would say that add-in has only access to the list within the current site, somebody could hack the code, like could try to stand on their head, and they wouldn't be able to do anything else because the contract between the add-in and the code only allowed for that. This is no longer the case in SPFx. Why? Because SPFx doesn't run inside an iframe. It runs as a part of the page. And as a part of the page, it can execute any REST call to any REST API or even CSAM API that is a part of your intranet. So think about it. It has access to search across the whole tenant. It has access to all your files, all your documents, permissions, taxonomy, user profiles, and whatnot. Basically, everything that is in your tenant and that the person currently on the page is allowed to do, that thing can do too. What's more, in SPFx, we have this ability that we can request permissions to other rare APIs. So imagine that, and that's one of the common cases that we see on intranets. Companies wants to have the personal area on the landing page that shows me my upcoming appointments. and that is coming from my calendar on Exchange. My web part by default that I build in SPFx cannot by default do that. But what I can do is I can have the web part request permissions to the Microsoft Graph and then specifically to my calendar or calendar of any user in the company, right? So if I grant that permission is not granted specifically to my web part. It's granted to any piece of JavaScript running in my tenant. Because as I said, my web part runs as a part of a page. So there is no way to isolate that in any way. So as a result, like if you would have somewhere embedded a widget that shows the weather or traffic jams or stock, and that would be exploited, and you have these high permissions or high access things available to you, like all these scripts could then read things like your personal email, your calendar, and whatnot, only because you globally granted permissions to APIs, and that could be the Microsoft Graph, but it could be as well some LOB application like your days off or trainings or projects. I don't know, right? So this is also a big thing that you have to take into account, right? That you have to have a proper way to think about like how do you grant per um, missions, and like what are the different things in your tenant that could potentially abuse them. Another thing that we also you see that because of it's so easy nowadays to tap into npm, one of the million packages that are there, and just pull them in to do this, to do that, to do this, to do that. It's very easy for devs, and the experience around it is very simple. Like you just type a command and you pull something in and it works. The problem is that oftentimes we don't really pay attention to what we actually pull in, because we might need a function, for example, that shows the weather, but that things might have dependencies of itself, right? So in the end, we don't pull a single dependency. We pull a dependency tree. So we pull dependencies with other dependencies with other, and that just grows. At the end of the day, like a web part might be a few megs. If you don't pay attention to the code you pull in, you might be pulling in, like your web part might be really bloated, and at the end, slow down the whole page, because every single time users come to your page, they have to pull in all that code. It needs to be parsed and ran, right? And that will slow down the rendering, because like your page will be empty for a long time, right? So also something that you really need to pay attention to, and there are ways, right? Because there are ways in SPFx to help you to understand what are the different things that you pull in packet, what are dependencies, how dependencies depend on other things, and so forth and so on, basically to help you to understand why hello world is suddenly, or a thing that shows just the weather is now three megs, right? So there are ways to do it, but you just need to be aware of it. You just need to be aware to pay attention to the size of your application and whether it's comparable, or whether it's adequate to what the application is actually supposed to do, right? So 3 megs to show the weather, you might think that is excessive. But 3 megs for a complete application that allows you to manage projects, customers, and so forth and so on might be actually a correct thing, right? So like don't blindly say that three megs is a lot, but keep in mind that you might be pulling in more code than you actually need, right? So that is also a thing to keep in mind. Now, another thing that was a big trend in the past, manipulating DOM. Like inject this here, make this thing round, make the side actions go from left to right because they would match UI better, and so forth and so on, right? So there was a big thing, and for a long time there was even Microsoft recommended us like this is the way to do things. This is no longer the case. Nowadays, especially when you are in the cloud, like in the past, we would have a release every 3 years, and we would very much control the whole experience, rollout, we would be able to test things up front, and so on and so forth. Nowadays, in Office 365, we get an update every week. Every week there is an update, and it might be something small, it might be something big. It might be something that will break your application if you don't pay attention. One thing that Microsoft recommends now is that stay away from DOM. When you build a web part, you get your own element, and within that element, you can do whatever you like. But don't play outside that element, because whenever you adjust something, it could be that next week that element is gone, and then your application will break. So page DOM is not an API. There is no SLA on it. The moment you start doing things, you will be on your own. You will be not supported. And whenever there is an issue, it could be that Microsoft will ask you, like revert it back, disable that, just to be able to get to the supportable state and then examine your issues from that point, assuming it's still there, right? So do not manipulate DOM, because changes are frequent, and you don't want to be in place where you will basically need to check every day, does your application still work? Because something might have changed, right? So uh, pay attention to that and basically unlearn this pattern from the past. And then another thing, the last thing on my top five list is the location where you host the web parts. And if there are admins around that, among us here in a call, um, that's an interesting thing, because when you think about it, the way it works is when you build an SPFx package, you can say you can embed the code inside the package, but you can also just point to a URL and say my code is located there. The challenging part is that it's developers who build the application decide whether it's including the code inside the package or not, and if not, where the URLs. It's developers who do that. And on a few times, I've already heard from a customer who was about to put something in production, and only then they realized, hey, like, why is this package pointing to a URL that we do not know? And then apparently it turned out that uh, the the manifest would point to a blob account owned by a developer, because they wanted to test something, they wanted to check things, and they forgot to adjust the URL. So almost that company would then deploy a package to production that would be running live with access to all the data from a location that has no SLA, is not supported by the IT. Developer can adjust the code as they please because there is no deployment to it. And it might as well go away, because dev can say, hey, I do not need this location anymore, so I will remove it, right? And then without knowing that that thing is actually being used in production. So you really need to pay attention where the things you put in production are located, and whether you're okay with that or not, whether you understand that this location does have an SLA or not, and if that SLA matches the SLA of your intranet or not. And also what important is, who has the access to the code and when they can update that, right? Because like really keep in mind that code will run under your permissions and has access to whatever the person that is currently on the page can, that code will be able to do exactly the same across your whole intranet. So with that, let me ask you one more thing. Let me stop sharing. There was this poll. So there's another poll that I will run. How how do you verify what the package does before actually you put it to production? And I will let the poll run for a moment, basically to give you a chance to answer. Again, it's anonymous. There's no way for me to pin it back to you. We consciously made it a single choice. So even you could say, well, we do docs and manual analysis. I'd like you to choose the one that reflects um, your choice the most, or where do you get the most from, right? So if you use docs only, let's say as a fact to have it, but majority of time is being spent on the manual analysis, do that. If you use only docs, choose docs, right? So we see some answers trickling in, and majority is doing manual analysis, which is good. So in a moment, I will show you exactly that, exactly like how does manual analysis of SPFX application look like? And then you can tell me whether I missed something that you do otherwise, or maybe you do other things, or maybe you will learn a thing or two, or maybe I will learn a thing or two from you, right? So it will be interesting to hear whether you do exactly or you look at the same things as I do or not. Cool. So I think that the votes are no longer coming in. Well, there's one. So let's end the poll now. And as you can see, some people don't. There are some who do docs. Majority does the manual analysis, home build scripts, and there are some who use SPFx, which is excellent, right? So with that, let's have a look at, if you wanted to better understand what has been built and what you are about to put in production and what kind of impact it might have on your environment, what is it that you would need to go through? So with that, let me switch to my Windows machine. I mean, I could do exactly the same on Mac, but I thought like majority of folks are on Windows, so let me try to align with that and basically give you less reason to wonder like why are the windows round, and just thought or think more about the contents of the screen, right? All right, so with that, I have here a package that was built by developers and that I got as an admin to put in production. I want to know what's in there before I do it. So first, let me look into the contents, right? And the .sppkg is basically a zip. So here I will use 7-zip to open it. And with that, I can see some files, some XML in there, and I can basically browse each one of them saying, okay, so is this something relevant? Well, yes, there is the name, its version, and so forth, but there's nothing really for me to assess in here, right? So we can go through other things. There's a feature. There's the activate the client-side web part name weather. Okay, fair enough, because that's supposed to be a web part that shows the weather. There are quite a few things in there, right? The one thing that I'm interested here is in this the folder named with a GUID. So here we see webpart.xml. And the first thing that already we can see here, if you know to pay attention to that, is that there is no code in here. So probably the code is stored elsewhere. The question, where? So if I open the contents of that XML file, I will see a lot of gibberish. And it kind of looks like a JSON escaped string. So let me just take all of this code, copy it to a code editor, create new file, paste it here. Let me unescape it. So basically unescape the ampersand quote so that I can read it more easily. Let me just replace that with a quote, replace it everywhere. And since it's a JSON file, let me change the type to JSON so that I can make it a little bit easier to read and make it like this. Okay, so now I can more easily see what's in there. So it's the weather web part. It's under development. I wouldn't call it under development. So maybe that's something that the dev should adjust still. It allows me to set the location, which is not set. And then here are some things that it does. So apparently it uses jQuery. Hey, and it uses jQuery 2.1. So I wonder if there is a known issue with jQuery 2.1, right? Because I will pull this code in. So I wonder if there's something that could be exploited about it. So how do I check that, right? So you could go like one way is to go to the site, the CVE details site, and here type jQuery, enter. And here you will have jQuery, a lot of links. Let's just pick this one, security vulnerabilities. And then here, apparently there are some issues. But here, like, okay, so we have version 2.1. So this is jQuery before 3.4.0. Okay, so that is something that is exposed through XSS. Okay, could be affecting us. jQuery 3.0.0 RC1, so that doesn't apply to us. jQuery UI before, no, that doesn't apply to us. Before 3.0.0, again, vulnerable to cross-site scripting. jQuery 1.4.2 doesn't. So like it's quite cumbersome to go through this list and actually determine, first of all, is there an issue in the version that you use? If so, how urgent or how big of a risk you have, and whether it needs to be patched or not. So as an alternative, you could go to the SNCC and database, search in here, and then here you see like you have more easily digestible overview of different issues in different versions, right? So in here, if we look at jQuery 2.1, well, so this one applies prototype pollution, which could be exploited by some other code. Here we have less than 2.2.2, greater than 1.12.3. So this applies to us. This doesn't. This doesn't. This doesn't. This doesn't. Right. So, and basically, again, like you need to go through all of them and then evaluate like, okay, how much of an issue is that? Is this something that could be exploited by someone and then take the action? So this is just one thing. So you would need to do that for every library, for every piece of code you embed. That is one. Two, apparently developers chose to load jQuery from codejquery.com. Who owns that? It's not your company. Is this CDN? Does it have an SLA? Can you find anything about it? Does it have downtime? How is it patched? Who can change the contents of that? Can it be changed? I don't know, right? So that might require some additional research on your part to basically find that out. Because the last thing you want to do is to have downtime during your working hours, right? So that's also an interesting part. Three, like we said that like the way it works is that yeah, like before the page will actually load and will show everything, users will need to load all these scripts. So you need to ensure that they work as quickly as they can, right? But how do you actually do it, right? So you could put it in the browser here. Let's load, and then we can see the network tab. Well, it loads pretty quickly, but is it okay, right? And then you have to go through the different things. Like, okay, so can this thing be cached? Because the last thing you want to do is for people who visit the internet multiple times a day to reload the same thing over and over again, right? So then you would need to look at the headers. Yes, it has cache in place. It can be cached everywhere. It's compressed, right? So these are the different things that are in place that you would need to investigate when you actually say, okay, this is okay for us to use, or maybe this is coming from a location that isn't really optimized to serve an asset. So yes, it's cool that we don't need to host this ourselves, but the location from which we load that, we either do not own it, we don't know who does, we don't know who can access to that, or maybe the location is just too slow for us to load and will slow down the whole intranet, right? Um, and then so that is one. Another one, apparently for the other script, they chose to use another CDN, right? So you also need to investigate that because that's different location, again, owned by somebody else, different SLA, and so forth and so on, like who has the access to it, and so forth and so on. Also interesting part, like it says jQuery simple weather, but who's to say that it does exactly that, right? Maybe that's just the name, maybe it does totally something else, right? So here, like that was the jQuery one, you would need to investigate all of that to go through this. Good luck with that. Like another thing is jQuery simple weather, it's not as extensive, but still like it's really tough to understand like what a thing does. And here you see some URLs, like Y image, here you see some other things. Like if you look for HTTP, you will see, well, so there are a few URLs here. There is the query, Yahoo APIs, and so forth. So you will need to understand, like, is this okay for this code to call this? Or maybe it's at some point exfiltrates the documents from your intranet, like, right? So a while back, I recorded a video that actually illustrates this case, where you would pull down a piece of code from internet, and that code for a big part, it was a really big piece of code, like think like this, long, and then for a big part, it would do exactly that. But then towards the end, there was like one more line added. And that line, what it would do is it would search for confidential docs in your intranet and then exfiltrate them by sending the whole contents to someone else. If you're interested in seeing that, let us know. We'll share with you the link to that video. Right, so going back to our assessment, like we've already seen that there are quite a few things to take into account. Another thing which is very interesting, what I said is that developers decide where the web parts will be loaded from. And in this case, they put it on SPFx, Blob, Core, Windows, Net. So the question is, who owns this? Is it owned by the dev or is it owned by your IT group inside the company and it falls under the SLA and permissions management and so forth and so on? Because this code will be loaded in production and will have access to all the data, right? So you have to ensure that it will not break during the working hours, and there is nothing there is nothing in there that does not belong there, right? So these are just the few things that you have to think about when you uh, assess your packages. When you think about, okay, I want to understand what a thing does before I put it in production. So like in the chat or in the comments, you can add whether you use the same way to investigate it or not, or whether you look for some other things. But for the sake of time, let's go on with the thing that we prepped and basically show you like what other ways are there for you to assess your code. So as we've seen, and I hope the point came across well, that it's really not very efficient to manually assess all of your code. Like every single time you have a package, open it up, verify all the URLs, all locations, even look at the minified code, because you really want to understand that there is nothing in there that doesn't belong in there, right? And it very much, if it's a person who does that, the accuracy depends a lot of what you know. So if you have someone who is very experienced on the team, and then on the other hand, someone who is not as experienced, you might get two different, and you probably will get different results based on their assessments, right? So it doesn't really give you this repeatable assessment report of your applications. And then also another thing is, like you said that majority of you, if I recall correctly, looks for vulnerable code, checks that every, I don't know, I think the most chosen option was month. Well, the interesting thing is that like new issues are being found in libraries every day. So in theory, if you check it only once a month, and even some, and that is the answer that we didn't have in a poll, the way they approach it is that they only check whenever their code would change. And that's interesting, because if you put something in production and there is no need to change anything in your code, it could be that you will use vulnerable version of jQuery or something else, maybe even for 2 years. And you could say, well, it's fine because my code didn't change. Well, yes, but there is issue in the library that your code uses, and your code will load on a page, and something else could exfiltrate, right? Or could exploit, right? So it's not an easy way out of jail card to say that, well, because my code didn't change, I don't need to analyze it. I only need to do it when my code will change. Well, no. The moment you pull something else, you also need to ensure that that thing is safe too, right? So from the security point of view, to recap, you really regularly need to scan dependencies. And as I said, new issues are being found every day. So ideally, you would have a nightly build in place that even though you do not deploy anything to production, you will still run these nightly checks. Are my dependencies still safe? Are they still sound? Or do I need to patch something to avoid risks? Ideally, this should not be a manual thing. Ideally, you have a way to automate that, whether through scripts or tooling or SPFx, right? But basically have a way to have a repeatable way of doing that, so that no matter who does that, whether it's me or you will get the same outcome, so that you don't depend on expertise. And also that it doesn't cost you so much time, because we know that like that we have more job than hours in a day, and at the end of the day we just do not scale to assess everything ourselves. And also another thing to keep in mind is that there is a way to isolate the web parts on a page, basically to run them inside an iframe. So whenever you build a web part that requires a privileged access to APIs, or things like personal things like email, sensitive things, calendar, LOB, you can isolate them from everything else on the page, basically ensuring that only your web part has access to these APIs and any other script across the whole intranet does not, right? So that is supported in SPFx. You just need to turn it on, right? And it only works in web parts. It doesn't work in extensions. From the performance point of view, there are also a few things that you have to keep in mind, right? So first of all, avoid heavy operations. There are a few things in O365 that if you do that, you really increase the chance that your code will get throttled, and even to the point where nobody across the company will be able to use the tenant. So there are really specific guidelines which operations they are, but as a rule of thumb, anything related to permissions, and especially inside loops, And do not combine too many things into a single execute call if you use things like JSON still, right? You don't want to make the batches too long because at the end of the day, they will translate into one big operation that server needs to unpack. And if that's too heavy, like you will put too much load on the farm, right? So you have to think about it. Another thing, as I said, be conscious, be really conscious about what you actually pull in and what dependencies your dependencies have, because at the end of the day, you pull all of that in. So use common sense to see if the package size matches the things that the application is supposed to do. When you choose to load scripts from external URL, that is a good choice in theory, but you really have to choose CDN that is optimized to serve the assets, meaning it allows proxies and networks to cache the assets. It doesn't expire them too often, right? Like I've seen people who would load assets from CDN that would have expiry of an hour. So basically 8 times a day, you would download the same script. Why? Right? So these are the different things for you to take into account. And if you have a lot of common code, like if you build a lot of things on SPFx and you have things like telemetry or logging or data access or so on, you can separate them into libraries that can be then cached. So when you open a web part, and so there's one cache, and two, they will be loaded on the page only once. So there is a concept of the library in SPFx, and there are great docs explaining how it works and how you approach it, right? So that's definitely something that you should into account. If you have if you have a common chunk of code that you share across many things that you build on SPFx, separate it out, because that will improve the loading time of your internet a lot. So with that, I'd like to show you, like, so you remember still like how we manually broke open the SPPKG file, went through all the XML, tried to analyze everything by ourselves, and like it would take us already a fair amount of time, not to mention I know what to look for where. If you don't, it might take you even more and you might miss some things. So an alternative way is to use SPCAF, right? SPCAF is an application that we have built at Rancor over a period of few years, and its main goal is to help you analyze whatever you can build in SharePoint. Whether that's WSP or whether that's SharePoint Framework package, whether that's a piece of script, doesn't matter. SPCAF can help you analyze quality of whatever you can build. And it's simple. Like, so here I have SPPKG, drag and drop. To optimize the analysis, I will say, well, this is an SPFx package, as opposed to like trying to apply all rules or minimal rules, right? So for this case, I will say SPFx, and I would then start analysis. Not to waste time for us to wait on the analysis, I already have the results. So let me open them. And here you will quickly see that in a glance, without really walking through the code, looking at things, parsing strings, parsing URLs, we'll get a really quick glance into what it is that we put in production. Apparently, in this case, we have 3 critical errors, 1 error, a lot of warnings. So definitely there's something for us to have a look at. So first of all, so what did we find? We found that web parts or that package load web parts from location that is not approved by IT. If you recall that, I said developers choose where applications will load from, and this is exactly this rule. It allows you to specify a whitelist of locations that IT owns, on which you have SLA, and anything that doesn't match this location will be flagged. So here you will see an error that we say, this web part is loaded from this URL, which is not an approved location. So this is an easy thing for you as an admin to give back to your devs and say, hey guys, I appreciate you build that, but you need to put it in locations A, B, or C, because we manage them, we own them, right? And we also explain this here in detail, like why is this an issue, why you have to think about it, and so forth and so on. Another thing apparently that we found is that the scripts we referenced are also referenced from locations that we do not approve. So apparently in this case, the IT didn't approve the use of code jQuery.com and CDN JS, because maybe at some point somebody did a review and they found that either the SLA does not match or permissions are too permissive, right? So maybe there are too many folks who can access that and change the code and so forth and so on, right? But the bottom line is that instantly we flag here that these scripts are coming from a location that the company is not comfortable with using in production. So these URLs need to be adjusted. And apparently also we found that the jQuery version that we used has a known issue. And here we will not only get that, but here we will also see the guidance to update that. So apparently in our case, we knew that already. We use jQuery 2.1, but the guidance is update jQuery at least to version 3.0. And we also offer you a link with more info about this issue, right? And apparently we found not one issue, but two issues. And so apparently there is another one that says 2.1. There is a known issue. You should update to the latest version, and that is coming from the issue at that time, right? So you might want to go to this link and see more about this issue, impact, and so forth and so on. But that is very easy way. Like it costed us probably a minute, maybe less, and we know instantly that there are issues in our code. Another thing that we see a lot is that over time libraries are being patched. Like maybe there are no vulnerable pieces in them, but maybe there are things that are optimized, improved. But that also means that you need to keep track across your whole intranet and all applications that you build, what versions you use, right? So apparently in this case, we say that we found version 2.1. We recommend you to update to the latest version within the same major range to basically ensure that so we will not recommend you to update to 3 because 3 is a major version which could potentially break your code, but 3 to 2 or 2 to 4 should be safe because it's still version 2, right? So we will also check that. Do you use the latest version of particular library from the versions that are available? And if not, think about it, or take it into account to update it, right? Because there might be some improvements that will speed up your experience. We also found that we manipulate DOM, right? Or we also saw that apparently one of the locations from which we pull scripts doesn't compress the contents or doesn't use cache, right? So all the things that impact the perceived performance of our intranet when this application will be put in production. So this is very easy way and also a repeatable way, because no matter if you use this test now, tomorrow, in an hour, whether it's me or you, is the same rule. So as long as you give it the same input and give the same rules, you will get the same output. The benefit you also get with SPFx is that we update the vulnerable or the list of vulnerable libraries every night. So we use a number of sources that we look at, and then we use that in our analysis. So as long as you run analysis every night or every day, you will get access to the latest uh, 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 latest list of vulnerable libraries, their versions, recommendations to patch, and so forth and so on. Because we do all that work for you so that you can spend your time on development as opposed to trying to keep track of all of that by yourself. Right? So this was very quick SPFx demo in a glance. I would love you to give it a try, right? So basically what you have seen is that because it's automated, you will get repeatable results and you will get them fast. Like even if we didn't wait the whole analysis, because I didn't want to waste time on that, it's really fast. Depending how big the package is, it's still minutes. It's not hours, it's not days. So it's something that you can do multiple times a day. Ideally, every single time there is a change in your code, but also every night, so that if you have vulnerable dependency, you know about it as soon as you can. And SPFx will do all of that by itself. So it will tell you about the latest vulnerabilities, poorly configured CDN that you use, manipulated DOM in your code that expose you to these issues with weekly update in 365 and more, right? So we have over, I don't know, 100 rules in SPCAF that span from everything from .NET code to PowerShell, JavaScript, and so forth and so on. And we keep adding to these rules, basically to give you as detailed as broad insight into the quality of your applications. So as I said, call to action. I would love you to give it a try. It's free, doesn't cost you anything else than your time, but that time that you will eventually win, right? Because I believe that if you use it, it will save you a lot of time, and it will help you to understand more easily what, like, are the applications that you are about to put in production, are they sound? Do you build proper code, or are it some things that could be improved, right? And you will get all of these results instantly. And it's for SPFx, add-ins, WSPs, and more, right? So there's here on the screen, you see the URL. If you go there, you will be able to get a trial. As I said, it's free. And I'd love to hear whether you like it, whether you think there is room for improvement, and whether it's something that you could use. So with that, my part is over. I think we have some questions in the Q&A. So let me have look at that if there's something that we should answer immediately, and otherwise we will pick them up after through email. So one is, are we still see the use case of farms host solutions at clients? We do see that companies who chose to stay on-prem, they keep the stance that they want to benefit of their investment. And in a way, it's true, right? Because if you compare what you can do with SPFx on-prem compared to what you can do with WSPs, well, WSPs are more powerful. Again, they come with caveat that the code you integrate in your farm, like, you will never be able to move it to the cloud, right? So maybe WSPs are very excessive and going to the very extreme of the spectrum, but maybe you could go with something like add-ins, which are cloud ready and which might give you more abilities on-prem now, especially for things like long-running operations, privileges elevation, because this is the code that you would be able to move as is to the cloud and then only replace the front end with SPFx, right? So that might be a better approach. Rancor or Veracode. So how do we compare to Veracode? SPCAF is the only solution that is specialized in SharePoint and Office 365. So there are many other code analysis solutions like Veracode, like SNCC, ReSharper, SonarQube, and they give you different degrees of analysis, right? Some look more on the quality part, some look at code smells, security, and so on and so on. But the things that they share in common is that they do not understand things like SPFx. They don't know that there is a manifest, that they don't know what is a web part, they don't know what is extension, they don't know of the specific quirks like disposal checks, right? So they will give you the generic analysis that you can just apply to basically anything in the market, but they will leave out the very specific things that over the course of years we learned that these are exactly the things that cause the most issues, the specific quirks for SharePoint. Right? Because these are the things that you need to know about. You need to know that there is an issue in this part or that part, right? So with that, I would say this is it. Thank you again for attending. As Tia said, we will share with you the recording. We will share with you the deck. We will answer the questions that we didn't answer live. And if there is anything, if you would like to know more, if you would love to try it, let us know. Yeah, Tias, do you have anything else to add before we leave?
Nothing to add here. Thanks for attending, also from my end. Yeah, see you next time.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Awesome. Thank you very much, guys. Take care. Bye.